A/B test our health and well-being. And so for those that aren't familiar with A/B testing, it was really born out of Silicon Valley. The reason why Facebook chose the colour blue for their logo was off the back of loads of little micro experiments, and they could see very quickly which area had the most impact with their audience and resonated, and they landed with blue. Now, I do the same when it comes to my well-being. Sometimes it's trialing different things in my sleep hygiene routine before I go to bed, or it might be exercising at a different time, for instance, or it might be having a different meal at lunchtime. There are loads of these little micro experiments that we can do on a daily basis to be able to learn about our own health and well-being, because what's good for me may not be good for you, Fergus, and what's good for you, Fergus, may not be good for the person listening to this session today. So the more we can have those little micro experiments, try out new things, whether it's different types of physical activity, for example, that's one of the key things for me to learn continuously about my own self.
Harry, how are you doing?
Good, thank you, mate. Very well. It's sunny in Manchester, which is strange, but very well. How are you?
I'm good, but it's not sunny in Scotland, which is not strange. So very, very predictable. But first things first, I have heard Champion Health described as the Netflix of well-being. Why is that?
Big statement, isn't it? So I'll give you a brief potted history on why that's been described as that. So I had my feet up one evening, glass of red wine as you do, watching Netflix. And Netflix had everything from Peaky Blinders through to The Crown, Peppa Pig for my 7-year-old nephew that ruined all of my algorithms. So I'm getting Dora the Explorer popping up and all sorts now. And I was also on my phone, as we are in the modern age, using 2 devices at once, consuming a lot of information. And I couldn't help but see how many well-being apps I had on the App Store, whether it was Calm or Headspace, whether it was a nutrition app, a workouts app, a mood tracking app, or it may be more around a learning and development platform. And I then went onto the App Store and found that there were 500,000 health apps on the App Store, all covering their own individual area. And that's where I couldn't understand that there wasn't a Netflix or an Apple or a Spotify equivalent that brought all areas of well-being together into one place. And when we looked at devising this, someone said, this looks like the Netflix of well-being. And so that's been a strapline that's really stuck with us ever since.
Did they get equity? I hope they did, because
that's so they didn't get the best deal.
Excellent, because that is the scene in a movie where everybody turns their heads and light bulbs go off, isn't it? That is that's the big one. Because I think that was what made me curious on LinkedIn when we first connected a few years ago. Was I thought, oh, that is a big statement. I wonder what's meant by that, because in a world of startups, it's difficult to understand what means what, essentially, isn't it? So it's good to see that it's developed into exactly that, which is a holistic space for all elements of well-being. So let's rewind a little bit to actually what led you to founding the business from a personal point of view, because your draw to well-being and seeing that gap in the market through the App Store is one thing, but actually having the conviction to follow that through must come from a place of personal experience and personal understanding of why this is needed.
Absolutely. So, and this is the most important element of Champion. I wouldn't be talking to you today if it's not for the story that I'm about to share. And if I rewind 5 years ago, I was working for the largest health and wellbeing provider in the UK. Very fortunate to work for them. And they were just looking at physical health at that time. And people kept on coming to us and saying, what about my financial well-being and the financial stress I'm experiencing? What about bereavement because I've just lost a parent? What about care and responsibilities? What about my sleep and insomnia for myself or for my children? And we kept on having to signpost to loads of different places. So that's really where the ethos came from. I suggested this idea at my previous organisation, and they said, Harry, you're 23, and pretty much left me out the room. So I left that company and founded Champion with a healthy dose of naivety. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But we were founded with a team of 60 academics. That's one of the most important things to us, is making sure that it's evidence-based and grounded in the latest research. But if I'm being completely honest with you, as a 23-year-old with a squeaky voice and couldn't grow a beard, and I still can't really grow a beard, was to be able to run a business from the operational side of things. I didn't know how to do that. So I approached a close friend of mine that I coached his kids at cricket, and it was the best trade I've ever done, whereby I traded my cricket coaching skills for his 2 kids, for his mentorship. And he was the youngest director on the FTSE 100 at the time. His career had gone from strength to strength, amazing partner and 2 kids, amazing impact on the community. He raised over £750,000 for charity. And the reason why I share with you this story today, Fergus, is James lived with positive mental well-being throughout his lifetime. He was the person that I aspired to be when I was 40 years old. And tragically, 4 years ago, almost to this day, my friend and mentor James ended up taking his own life following a short bout of stress. When I say a short bout, it was a 2-week bout of stress. And this is someone that, again, I aspired to be, I wanted to be able to emulate. And now it's all about how can we continue James's legacy beyond. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for James's help and support in the first 6 months of starting Champion.
So thank you for sharing that with us, first of all, because I know these things are always difficult to talk about, especially when the big question that comes off the back of that is why. I had Paul McGregor on recently. His episode actually came out yesterday, where he said he still lives with that question now, even, 13 years on. And how did that galvanize your passion for this? Was it a sense of panic? Was it a sense of empowerment that you were sort of steering the ship in terms of being able to tackle this? Because I know business to business means that you've got access to organisations, but there must have been a part of you that thought, well, we need to make this business a consumer, even though that's infinitely more difficult. So the emotion that surrounded that, how did you manage to channel that in the direction that's got you to the point you are now? Because I can imagine that itself was a very difficult thing for you as an individual to calibrate on.
Yeah, great question. My initial feeling was numbness, and I can almost, recalling it, just have a sense of that feeling where I didn't believe my friend that told me. And I just became numb. And it took me a good couple of days to lose that feeling, to come to reality and come to terms with what happened. And my brain works very much, and this works against me at times, is I always try and look for solutions. So when a friend's talking to me about their challenges with mental health, my immediate reaction, and it's not the best reaction at all, is how can I help them? How can I solve the problem? And we know that's not the ideal scenario. But in James's case, it was how can I do something to solve this issue? So I went to speak with some of his colleagues at the organisation that I got to know. And they said, one of the people said that they spotted the warning signs but didn't know what to do. This individual was a receptionist, and they were saying that it was only the senior members of the team that had training and access to mental health support within that organisation. I spoke to some other people, and again, they said, I didn't know what to do. I was worried that would make the problem worse, or they may not have even spotted the warning signs at all. So that was one of the first things that we looked at, is how can we make mental health and wellbeing accessible to all? So it's not just for the C-suite. It's not just mental health first aid for 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. It's mental health training basics, the foundations, and mental health literacy for everyone. So people like James could get access to this kind of education to be able to understand more around their emotional intelligence, their own mental health. So if challenges do come up, what can I do about it? How can I access other services, for example? But also James's colleagues, friends, family members. So that's something that we really focus on now, is not just looking at the individual, but also looking at the wider community. And there's a feature that we launched of friends and family access, because that's something that we find really key. Again, I'll talk through that a little bit more. But everything now just comes back to when I woke up this morning, my why. And that's my why, is how do we help people like James whilst they're thriving and whilst they're well? And then how do we help people like James that may be struggling to get them into services faster and earlier than before? So that's the fire in my belly, and it's something that across the Champion team, we're a team of 120 now, making sure that they all have their own specific why as to why they wake up in the morning and do the job that they do.
It's the most important question to ask oneself. I constantly come back to. Again, it's the reason I do the athletic things that I do. It's the reason that I pursue the problems that I create for myself in the way that I do, because essentially I kind of view every commercial aspect as just another problem to work around. So that is the question I think everybody listening should probably ask themselves now, or at the very least afterwards. And I think the point you're at now is a lot of what you've just said has been achieved, which is fantastic. So I'm sure it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows getting to this point. So I'm sure there are countless, but what have been the biggest challenges along the way in terms of growing the business? Because there's numerous compliance considerations. There is the constant emotional demand that goes with creating this sort of business. There's staffing demands. What are the things that you've struggled with that you've come out the other side of?
You've highlighted 3 big ones there. And it's almost difficult to be able to summarise it down into one or two things, because every single day there's a new challenge. And you mentioned not everything can be rosy across the period. It's still not. We're doing very well as an organisation, but every organisation globally is facing its own challenges, whether that's recruitment challenges, whether that's challenges in forecasting, for example, or compliance, all of these areas and arenas. And we're in a great position now, but if there weren't those challenges, then we wouldn't be where we are now if we didn't spot them. So I'd say from a personal perspective, one of the things that I was conscious of when I was younger was that I was young. I was green. If you looked at my CV, there wasn't that much on there. I worked from when I was 15, 16 as a cricket coach and in hospitality, but really in Wellbeing, what's that got to show? And there was a mild bit of imposter syndrome, but I was happy to throw myself in the deep end and get armbands and learn how to swim and stay afloat. But the biggest thing that I learned was initially I was going to people to ask them questions, like James, for example, or it may be other mentors. And I've been extremely fortunate that everyone has really looked to help me out. And when we've asked for help, they've been able to offer it. But the challenge that I had was, okay, this person has done this, they've got this CV, they've got this level of experience, therefore I need to implement what they're saying. And so I started listening and acting upon every single piece of advice. And what I learned was that there's no one single path to success. Because I was saying, okay, this person said it needs to be an online business. This person said it has to be face-to-face. This person said we need to charge annually in advance in our commercial model. But then this person said, actually, we need it on a monthly subscription basis. And so I was going to my co-founder and saying, we need to change this, we need to change this, we need to change this. And he said, well, you said the exact opposite last week. So the biggest lesson that I've learned is that I need to talk to these people, I need to listen to them, but I need to apply it into my own context. And my gut feel is really important, that intuition within there. So if someone does recommend something, of course, listen to them, get the context behind it, but then only apply it if it fits into the context and the timing for what we're looking to do. So that was one of the big challenges that I overcame, with a mild element of imposter syndrome, I guess. But then the other thing was how to convince people to join your team, how to convince people to go from £50,000 a year to £30,000 a year initially, because that's all you could afford, that were in secure jobs in the public sector with a strong pension. So our head of operations used to be a deputy head at a school, really secure job. He was employee number 2. And so getting the people to take that punt was a big challenge. And also winning the first client. I remember that feeling of winning the first client. And there was a little dance that I did in the car on the drive home, probably not the safest thing on an A road. But winning that first client, convincing them that this is something to part with their hard-earned cash. There have been so many challenges, so many bumps on the way, but they're there to be overcome.
Just for context on that as well, so people can understand the process of gaining that first client and the dance. I think we're all imagining you doing at the moment. I think I can see it. I've done similar ones in the past myself. But what is the process? What is the product for the organisation? Is it variable dependent on their staff numbers, their culture? How do you go in and isolate what that organisation requires, and then how is that delivered?
Yeah, so there are two main challenges that we see when it comes to health and well-being in the workplace. The first one is, how do we equip individuals with the right resources, tools, techniques to be able to support their well-being in a personalised way? So that's the first element. The second element then is how we create cultures that can drive positive change and how we can get the data to be able to enable that. So there are two elements of our platform. One is the employee platform, that Netflix of Wellbeing. Starts with a 10 to 15 minute online wellbeing assessment. Through the AI and algorithms, then produces a personalised report. And so if you're experiencing insomnia, we've got Professor Jim McKenna, for example, a world-leading behavioural scientist and specialist within sleep, that's got a masterclass on insomnia within the platform. Or it might be a 28-day sleep programme that we'd put you on through the tech, for instance. So that's one area. And you've got all of your nutrition plans, all of your sleep support, sleep stories, mindfulness, workouts with GB Paralympians through to Olympians. So it really is that holistic well-being that you mentioned earlier, Fergus, that brings everything together. And it also integrates with the company's existing services. So we can look to utilise the counselling programs or the physiotherapy that might be provided through private medical insurance. So that's a little bit about the employee, but really where we have huge impact is through the leadership hub. And that's where all of the anonymised data sits within. So you can't identify Harry from Fergus within the company, but what you can say is that 60% of people are experiencing moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety. Off the back of that, we can then look at, okay, this demographic, this department may be struggling the most. Again, it's all anonymised, so you can't identify the individual. And then we look to plan and implement cultural change initiatives around that. And that's really powerful for the organisation to be able to see the data instead of looking at absence data, which looks at 2 to 4% of people annually, or at any given time, we can look at the 96 to 98% that may be turning up to work, as well as those that may be off absent. So it's very much a proactive and early intervention approach rather than when it's too late and reactive.
I'm putting you on the spot here because I didn't ask you to provide this data beforehand, and it might have required prep. But given that you've had that reporting pre and post pandemic, given the lifespan of the business, what are the trends in terms of that data that you've noticed pre versus post?
Great question. And this is something that we've launched global reports that have been featured in the likes of Forbes, all the way through to all of the publications that you might be reading on a Sunday morning. One of the big things is the demographic and the difference in demographics in terms of age range, especially when it comes to financial well-being and mental well-being, that unsurprisingly, the younger elements of the workforce, the millennial generation, are really struggling at the moment, whether it's getting on the housing ladder, whether it's making ends meet, all the way through to struggling with anxiety. So we've seen a huge increase in challenges for that specific demographic. We've also found, in relation to the demographics, the differences in gender. And so females are much more likely to be experiencing symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression, but we know that males are much more likely to be experiencing suicidal ideation, and off the back of the ONS statistics, much more likely, or 3 times as likely, to end up taking their own life as well. So there's loads of fascinating data. What I do, and encourage anyone that's listening to today's session, is go on the Champion Health website, go on the Insights section, and there are loads of reports there that you can find the data and you can look to utilise within your organisation or learn more about, because there's some fascinating elements within there, whether it's the correlation between sleep and mental health, all the way through to looking at specific age ranges and what we can do to support them as well.
How much did you have to pivot the business during and post-pandemic? Because amidst founding the business, road mapping the business, plotting everything out, hiring person X for job Y, a pandemic probably wasn't part of the equation. So the challenges that came as a result of that, and the landscape that you were working within, very quickly changed. So how did you as an organisation have to adjust to be able to manage that, and most importantly, manage to keep moving the business forwards?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we were slightly fortunate in a way when the pandemic came, that we were set up for scalability, and the world that we're operating in. It's a digital platform. We have a lot of customer success teams and people that do go into the workforce, but we could deliver that on Zoom. But the platform and the tech was there, and it was very scalable. But what I would say is we pivot regularly. And so, pandemic aside, that's something that's really a core part of our business. And that's one of the reasons that I always believe that startups will always exist and will always have success. Because corporate organisations, the organisation that I was at previously, 17,000 employees, I was at the bottom of the food chain, and rightly so. I was suggesting ideas that could have revolutionised that business potentially if they were executed well. And they were having none of it. It was something that they would rather see a startup and then succeed and then acquire them once the business model has been proven within there and the impact's being demonstrated. So we pivot on a regular basis off the back of client demands, off the back of client feedback, off the back of data, and that's really important, but also on the back of gut feel. And not enough people talk about that. And so when COVID hit, there was a huge program that we put together around a response for COVID, around what we can do to support our colleagues from a mental health standpoint and emotional support standpoint, as well as what we can do to be able to look after ourselves. And we launched this a week after the UK went into lockdown. And so that was one way that we looked to pivot. We looked to use our gut feel of, look, we haven't got the data here, but we know that there's something serious that's going to go on around people's health and well-being and mental health specifically. We need to do something to support those individuals and support their colleagues, friends and family members. So I would say that, yeah, there's been some huge changes within the business. We've pivoted regularly. I've made a lot of mistakes, but fortunately the mistakes have been fairly minor that can be tweaked. So I am a big believer in the fail fast analogy, but if you fail all the time, you may not have an organisation. So I also approach that piece of advice that we see on Instagram with a little bit of caution as well. But I am a big believer in launch early, launch fast, learn from it, and then go again.
You need to move quickly in this day and age, don't you? Because everything's just tornadoing around you. I don't think tornadoing can be used in that context, but I'm gonna coin that as a phrase if it hasn't yet been used before. So you've already flagged it, and it's an obvious one. It's something that's spoken about, and there's no awareness required around this. But the nuances between men and women in terms of how these things are processed and managed, I think from a societal, personal point of view, it's a bit clearer in terms of how we can be a bit more empowered to look after our own mental health. But within an organisation specifically, how do you understand those nuances, and more importantly, how do you implement different strategies for men versus women? Because targeting that is a key part of what you deliver, isn't it? So obviously the individuals can access the information for themselves within the platform, but what are the strategies that you've implemented to better target those categories?
Yeah, so the first thing that we would always encourage is to listen, and it's twofold in terms of the listening. Listen to what employees are saying, and listen to the data as well that you've got available, or if you've not got the proactive data, that's something that we would strongly encourage with or without Champion. And off the back of that data, you can be really targeted. And so it may be that females are really struggling with financial stress and stability. There can be specific interventions that you can put in place there, such as raising the awareness of your existing services, of encouraging people to the auto-enrolment to pensions, to not opt out of their pension scheme, for example. There are loads of little things that the organisation can do there. With men's health, for example, we're doing live sessions around men's health. I know it's something that you do, and you do very well, Fergus, as well. Around reducing the stigma around masculinity and men's mental health specifically, raising awareness around that. I'm a big believer that awareness days do have their place. They're not the be-all and end-all, but they're great opportunities to raise awareness within specific cohorts, whether it's World Menopause Day or whether it's Men's Mental Health Day, for example. And so there's some specific interventions that we can recommend. There are also guides that we'd encourage you to create as an organisation, and within your handbook there might be specific areas as well. So I've seen certain organisations do things such as a menopause policy, and having a specific amount of leave that the individual can then access within there. It's very much based upon the data and what employees say they want and what employees are saying from the data as well. That's what we would encourage.
Do you ever miss cricket coaching?
I do. Big time.
Does the stress of all this ever make you wish that you'd found contentment in doing that full time?
No.
Very clear. Very clear.
No.
Which is a good position to be in at the level you're at, because the resolve that's required to take a business to the place that Champion Health has got to, I think, comes from that resolve, which leads nicely into the question of May this year. There was an acquisition with a sort of runway plan built in, wasn't there? So twofold from my end. How has the business changed? And then we'll come back to how have you changed as a result of it. So first and foremost, how has the business changed as a result of the acquisition earlier this year, and what does it mean for the business essentially?
Yeah, so we were acquired, as you mentioned, a good few months ago, and what we broke down, and it's quite an early stage to be acquired for a team. I never set out on this process to be acquired. I was probably quite naive, because someone said to me, there are two things that will happen to this business. It will either go bust, or it will be acquired and you'll be part of a bigger group. And I said, nah, that's never going to happen. I just want to have impact. And that was very much my ethos, very much still is my ethos. But when organisations are saying, look, we're really interested and we could do X, Y, and Z with your business to be able to get it into more geos, more locations, into more hands, impacting more lives, I started going, well, actually, that is something to take stock of, and I've taken a huge risk. I didn't pay myself for the first 2 years of the business. My mum was one of the early shareholders. Not many people know that, and so there's a lot of pressure there. Not from her, but that I put on myself. My co-founder took a huge risk from a design agency that he built up from when he was 14 years old to when he was 29, working with Deloitte, the NHS, Man City. And so quite an inspirational guy, and he took a punt to be able to join us full time. And we broke down that if there are three things that are achieved, we're happy to go ahead with an acquisition, and we go full pelt into it. One is shareholder value. That's something that is absolutely vital, and we don't shy away from. That we took big risks, and we deserve reward as long as we're having impact. The second one is that impact piece. That if the impact can be greater after the acquisition and the legacy of what we're trying to create off the back of the story that I shared at the start of this session, then again, this is something we'll take seriously. And the third thing is the team. I owe so much to the team and the Champion Health team. And it's interesting because some of them have said we really owe a lot to Champion Health, and we really owe a lot to the shareholders in the group. And so we've got a really nice dynamic across the team and culture. And there was one organisation that we were nearly acquired by until they said, we're going to restructure the organisation. There may be some redundancies. We walked away from that very quickly, and because that was really important, we made it really clear to the team, if these three things are achieved, we'll go down this route. And we were very fortunate that PhysiTrack came along. They've been looking at our stuff. It fitted in really well to what they're looking to achieve, and I'll go through that in a moment's time. And that went through within a 2 or 3 month period, and it was quite remarkable, the work that's happened since. So the cultural fit's been fantastic. They're like a larger startup, so they work very fast. They're operating in 180 countries globally. They're a NASDAQ listed company, so that's one of the things that's changed to your question, is there are more regs, there's more compliance, but it's all for good reasons and good purposes. Rather than having 4 shareholders, there's now thousands. And there's more spotlight on us, but that's a great opportunity for us to be able to extend our impact going forwards as well. So that's why we were acquired, that's why we went down this route, for the legacy, for the shareholder value, and for the team. And yeah, there's been a significant amount that's changed, but for good, I'd say. And I think the team would probably agree with that too.
What does that mean for the business then? Is it simply more people accessing the platform? Is it the platform developing what it offers? Is it purely resource to allow further scalability within what already exists? What is the actual strategy as a result of the acquisition?
So it'd be all three of those things. So there's funding for growth. First of all, whether it's in content production, whether it's boots on the ground, spreading the word, getting more developers. And so that's one area. Another area is also their expertise. They've got huge levels of expertise. They're translated into multiple languages. They're operating in 180 countries globally. And one example of that already that we can demonstrate is that we were in 20 countries at the point of acquisition a few months ago. We're now in 124 countries, supporting people in Southeast Asia, for example, that we know traditionally have less access to mental health care. But the biggest thing for me, and this is my vision when it comes to well-being, is how can we join it all up together? And we've done a great job in the preventative space in building an ecosystem that can support employees in all areas of their well-being, but also support the organisation in building cultural change initiatives. But what about when things go wrong? What about when an individual needs to access counselling, needs to access physiotherapy, may need a coach, for example? So that's what we've just launched across the last month, is immediate access into a physiotherapist if you're experiencing back pain, all the way through to a psychotherapist. And we're looking at health coaching going forwards as well as an arena to explore. So you've not, again, got to provide 5-10 different platforms across your organisation. You've got one platform that can cover it all.
What are the implications for the business in that sense, as in the customer? Because obviously, higher access to fast-acting services requires higher costs at your end, which I assume requires higher billables in terms of the businesses. So has that all been well received? Are organisations seeing the value in these things? Or do you still think there is an element of checkboxing going on?
Yeah, it goes back to your question earlier of the pivoting. So we will continue to pivot. We won't land on the exact model that we'll be operating in a year's time. And so what we're doing with clients is we're being very flexible. So we'll offer the tech as we do, and then we've got add-ons that they can choose as part of a package. So some organisations might say, we've got the counselling or we don't want the counselling, but we really want physiotherapy. So that's something that then we can add into the system, and we built the tech to be really flexible and malleable around the customer's demands and their needs, and off the back of the data as well. So the data may demonstrate that 80% of people are experiencing high stress levels. That's where, okay, well, the counselling will be perfect within there, but the physio might not be right. So we've got an element of flexibility within. Some organisations have gone for a pay-as-you-go model, which is quite rare for this space. And so upon accessing physio, if they access 100 sessions within the month, it will then be charged out at X. It's great for an organisation with flexibility, but it's harder to budget. Whereas some companies have said, okay, we're going to estimate 5% utilisation, therefore we're going to charge a set fee with a small margin on top, so we can keep the lights on across the business. And they've said, yeah, we want to go ahead with that because it gives us more security. If the engagement isn't quite there, then that's a risk that we've taken. So we've been quite flexible when it's come to that, but I'm sure that will adapt and change off the back of client demands and client feedback.
Fascinating. And to return to the second element of my twofold question earlier, and to also add in a blend of another question I was interested to ask, is going back to your friend and mentor that sadly passed away 6 months into the business. What are the challenges that you see in C-suite individuals versus those, I don't want to say beneath them, because that sounds like a very negative way of describing the hierarchy, but those that report into them throughout an organisation? Because that, in and of itself, answers the second element of my question, whereby how are you doing as a result of the acquisition? Because your baby, the often used startup phrase, is no longer solely yours. You've had to hand over the keys to some degree. You're still very much actively involved, but it's not on premise the same as it was. And whilst it might seem the same day to day, there'll be that thought in the back of your head that it isn't quite the same. So as a C-suite individual yourself, how have you been coping with this? But then secondly, what are the trends that you've seen with C-suite individuals, and then the comparison of those that report into them?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of pressure, right? There's within the world of work, we're responsible for a lot of people's livelihoods. There's a changing landscape. We need to always stay ahead. I'm a very competitive person, naturally, and I work very hard. But that's something that I've learned over the period of the last 4.5 years, is how to look after myself during this period. And I'm still learning at the moment. With increased scalability means extended workloads. So I'm doing well. I definitely have times where I've had a family member that's been very ill across the last year, and that's been a challenge at times to be able to juggle. But you learn so much about yourself. You learn so much about time management, and you learn so much about other people as well when you face hardship within your life. But the thing that I always wake up and remember is I'm in such a privileged position. First of all, to be able to be in the job that I'm in. Second of all, to be able to have a roof over my head. And third of all, to be able to support so many people. And that's why we do what we do. And it goes back to James's story, is to, I think I'd be in a really dark place if I didn't have the challenges that I have. And if I wasn't helping people that could be in James's position, I think there'd just be something in a disconnect in my life. So whilst there are challenges, whilst workload is high, and it should be high, I'm in a really good place at the moment, and I'm very happy with where I'm at. In terms of C-suite individuals, there's a big challenge there, without a shadow of a doubt. Where do they turn to? They are the face of the organisation, and there are definitely some days where I've not been 100%, where I've turned up and I've been vulnerable in front of the team, but I still do have to have an element of supporting the team and being there, being switched on to be able to help them. And whilst I do show that vulnerability, I'm still needing to lead from the front and be there to help them. And I think there's a really interesting arena of toxic masculinity within the C-suite as well. Something that I know you talk about extensively, Fergus, and you're more of an expert in that area than I am. But that vulnerability is absolutely crucial for leaders to show. permitting that, because it's not weak to be able to have those conversations with your team, and it leads to huge amounts of strength across the team, huge amounts of bonding as well. But without a doubt, I do see that across teams, where the senior leadership team feel like they can't connect with other people across the business, may not be able to connect with their partners, and that's where there is a stigma that needs to be broken going forwards.
I think it is moving forwards, but it's the pressure that goes with it that creates this false dichotomy of I can never show weakness, rather than I need to acknowledge when I'm feeling weakened, because that's when you need to sort of take a step back and fix your armor, essentially. Yeah. Because I always try and put it into the context of productivity. A healthier, more cognitive, more available emotionally leader is a more productive one, and effectively a higher income earning one, a higher income generating one, which stems down the whole way through a business. So interested to get your take on this, because something I've isolated through, I think, organisations of over 100,000 employees total up to date with the work that I've done, fortunately, in the background. Not something I spend as much time talking about on social media, but for those listening that aren't aware of that, that is a key part of my business in the background. And I have isolated middle management as essentially being the stumbling block for most organisations, because you have a lot of senior leadership team, a lot of men in C-suite positions who have become aware of this. And the trend I've noticed there is often those from sporting backgrounds tend to be a lot more emotionally available when it comes to this discussion. However, middle management, because of the pressure to perform, because of the competitive arena for promotion, because of the pressure with the age they tend to be, that comes with young children, that comes with potentially school fees, that comes with all these things, which means that there's this bubble of security they tend to create around themselves where they feel they can't show any weakness, because that will affect their future potential. And then you've got the juniors who are new to their career, who are open-minded, who have a different perspective on mental health in general terms, have a different perspective in terms of what they want to gain from their career. And then this middle section means that the juniors can't report into the middle, which means it doesn't get up to the SLT. And the SLT stays to the middle that's important, but it doesn't actually trickle down, because if the juniors aren't comfortable talking to the middle, then it doesn't matter, and the whole organisation breaks down. So from your work to date, is that something that you've noticed, and how is it something that, as an organisation, you've overcome?
If there's one cohort within an organisation that I'd encourage a company to invest in when it comes to their well-being, it would be middle managers, without a shadow of a doubt, for all of the reasons that you mentioned. That traditionally, across society, they're more likely to be parenting younger children, more likely to have a mortgage and be paying off that mortgage. There are so many stresses across the organisation as well, from top down, bottom up, side to side. And I think that there's a real challenge there, because often these individuals want to get to either C-suite or promote beyond them, and they're also dealing with a new demographic coming into the workforce that are facing a lot of challenges as well. And some organisations now are saying that you've almost got to act as counsellors, as well as do your job. And I think that's something we need to be really careful of, is how much we do put on our middle managers, whereas how much we do actually share responsibility across the organisation. And this is a big ethos that I have, is how can we take things away from middle managers and spread it across the organisation, so we all have a collective responsibility to be able to take care of one another, to be able to spot the warning signs of poor mental health, to have a conversation, whether it is over Zoom if you're a remote workforce, or over the phone, or whether it is over a coffee table, for example. I do feel an element of empathy for the middle managers, where it's more and more piled upon their plate, more responsibility, more pressure, and inevitably, if you put your foot on a balloon that's blown up, then that pressure will give and eventually pop, unfortunately. So I think that's a demographic that needs coaching, it needs training, and it also needs things taken away, not added on, where possible.
So we focus very much on the corporate world, the business-to-business setting, but along the way I'm sure you will have learnt an awful lot about individuals in and of themselves. So to finish things off today, what are the low-hanging fruit recommendations you would give to those listening to better manage their own mental health?
The first thing is to take individual responsibility, and to not look elsewhere. I think as human beings, naturally we look to go elsewhere, potentially point the finger where we can look in the mirror, and I do this regularly when it comes to my own well-being, my own performance. It means then that I take individual responsibility. The second thing that I'd recommend also is to A/B test our health and well-being. And so for those that aren't familiar with A/B testing, it was really born out of Silicon Valley. The reason why Facebook chose the colour blue for their logo was off the back of loads of little micro experiments whereby they tested red versus blue, who clicked on it most. They then tested blue versus black, they then tested black versus green, and they could see very quickly which area had the most impact with their audience and resonated, and they landed with blue. Now, I do the same when it comes to my well-being. So for me, a plant-based diet doesn't work. I feel quite lethargic, but it's something that I trialed and A/B tested. I need a high-protein diet to be able to have the energy throughout the day. Sometimes it's trialing different things in my sleep hygiene routine before I go to bed, or it might be exercising at a different time, for instance, or it might be having a different meal at lunchtime. There are loads of these little micro experiments that we can do on a daily basis to be able to learn about our own health and well-being, because what's good for me may not be good for you, Fergus, and what's good for you, Fergus, may not be good for the person listening to this session today. So the more we can have those little micro experiments, try out new things, whether it's different types of physical activity, for example, that's one of the key things for me to learn continuously about my own self. And it builds my self-awareness as well.
I couldn't agree more. The second point there is a very, very key point of the presentation. Well, it's the one element other than my story that I include in almost every presentation I give, because I just encourage people to be mindful of how they respond to the things that happen to them on a day-to-day basis. Oh, I feel terrible after having that lunch. Make a decision off the back of that. It's not just a case of, oh, it is what it is. Oh, I feel really, really exhausted this morning. Well, why is that? Let's look back. Well, you had 3 pints at 6 p.m. last night. That could be it. You watched one extra episode of Modern Family, or you didn't take that sleep supplement, or you actually trained in the evening rather than the morning, or you had a really stressful argument with your boss. You can kind of work backwards and then you can plot these things out. So it's being mindful of them. So to summarize, couldn't agree more. Finally, where is the best place for people to get more information on Champion Health and yourself?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is the social channel that I use for work. So if anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, that would be amazing. Drop me a message and a direct message, and I'm more than happy to have a chat at some point. And when it comes to Champion, just Google Champion Health. You'll be able to see everything on our website. There are some amazing guides and reports that have huge levels of data within there as well to back up all of the interventions that we suggest. And then if you're wanting to find out more about Champion Health specifically, you can book a demo and one of our wonderful champions will be able to take you through that.
So for anyone with sway in their organisation, you know where to go. Thanks very much, Harry. Really enjoyed that, and hope you have a good rest of the day and get to spend some quality time with your 12-week-old Black Lab puppy.
Thank you, Fergus.